and and the recording is in progress. Good. So we'll have this for history. Um, the today's speaker is going to get introduced by Dawn White, and in fact, Dawn, right before Tom was joined us, Dawn had gone back and looked, and it's been 4 years since Tom last spoke to the RAPS membership.
Enough
So,
time for you to forget my last performance.
so I'm sorry I stole your thunder, Dawn, but I thought that was an interesting tidbit. So this is Dawn White, who's going to introduce the speaker who needs no introduction. Dawn, you're muted.
Thank you. Okay, so I just have to warn Tom that we're not going to wait another 4 years to invite him back. So it's so great to have Tom Potiowsky back with us. Tom retired in 2017 after 35 years at Portland State. He joined the economics department in 1982. And during that time, he also served as the official economist for the state of Oregon. Are we getting feedback?
A little bit. Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. Served as the economist for the state of Oregon on two separate occasions. The first one was from 1999 to 2006, and then again from 2008 to 2011. And during this 35-year period at Portland State, he also served as the chair of the department several times, it seems like. It probably does to Tom anyway. He was a very good colleague. Since retirement, actually before retirement, Tom was the former director of the Northwest Economic Research Center, NERC, which is housed at Portland State, and he's now serving NERC as a senior advisor. NERC focuses on economic research activities to support public policy and private objectives in the greater metropolitan area and the Pacific Northwest. Tom is going to be talking to us today about, and I love this title, the economic consequences of COVID-19 and hereafter, the adverb, not the noun. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to Tom, but I also want to talk about the wonderful headline that Doug Swanson put in the last rap sheet. His headline for the article about Tom was How COVID-19 Infects the Economy. So Tom, thank you for speaking to us again, and over to you.
All right, thanks, Don. I love puns, so that's great. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about, and this issue, by the way, is so big in terms of the pandemic and how it's affected the economy, how it's affected people's lives. So I'm not, in a sense, going to do justice to the whole issue, but I hope to hit some of the main aspects and points and hopefully be informative to you. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and let's see, here we go. And let me put this on presentation mode. And that's, hopefully everyone's seeing that as a full screen. You can shake your head or wave or, and by the way, I think as I go through, since we're such an informal group here, let's, if you want to break in and ask a question or something like that, please go ahead. Rather than my keeping this sort of somewhat semi-formal type presentation going. So to start off, broadly talking about the business cycle and the recovery that we're seeing. And I have here that the business cycle is a reverse square root with a K recovery. Now, what the heck is that all about? Now this symbol over here, this is the square root symbol. This is not some pagan religious symbol, okay? It's really a mathematical symbol but it's still associated, I would say, with a very ancient society, because you don't see this symbol anymore. Now, those of you that struggled with math as you were going through school, this symbol is as evil as 666 to you. But disregard that. Think about the square root symbol here, and then this is the reverse, right, of that symbol. So down below here, here's what I mean by this reverse square root symbol. You know, the economy's moving along, almost at full employment, that pandemic hits. We have a sharp downturn in economic activity. But just as restrictions are starting to lift, businesses partially open, you have a very rapid increase, but then it kind of stalls out a little bit. So that's the sort of, if you were looking through time, that's the sort of reverse square root that the business cycle is following in the economy. Now, the K recovery refers to that there's a split in the economy. Who's, you know, as we're having recovery, who is recovering and who is really lagging behind? Now, I want to emphasize, when economists talk about a recovery, it's a technical term in the sense that you've hit bottom and you're starting to now increase. But when you hit bottom, you're in the bottom of the pit. When you start to recover, you're still in a pit. You haven't gotten out of it yet, but you're starting to climb out of it. So a recovery is not everything is fine and rosy. There are still pain. There are tough adjustments being made, you know, so keep that in mind. You know, I so often I get the charge that if I talk about a recovery, I'm callous. I'm not considering that people are still in pain and so on. They are. You know, just like when you have a hip replacement, you know, it takes 6 weeks to recover. The first week you're in recovery, but you ain't feeling too good yet, right? So I just want to emphasize that part in terms of recovery. So, but the K recovery here is that there's a disproportionate hit in this pandemic, in this particular recession. Sorry, I forgot to remove my landline phone from the office. Anyways, so the face-to-face type businesses have been mainly hit, really service businesses, restaurants, hotels, hair salons, gyms, that sort of stuff. And the businesses tend to employ people that are generally at lower wages. And so what you have, this K-type recovery, is that you have one part of the economic spectrum, people that are relatively higher wage, and have higher wage jobs, they are doing relatively okay and aren't impacted as heavily by this recession. Those people that are generally low wage, low income, that are concentrated in the jobs in these service industries that have been disproportionately hit, they are struggling more during this recovery. So that's what I mean by the K recovery, where you have a sort of a split as to who is recovering more better in a way, and those that are struggling more. Now, this is gross domestic product. It's our broadest economic measure of economic activity. These are yearly percentage changes. And we can see here that this was the Great Recession, the one that we went through from late 2007 through mid 2009. And you can see that our annual drop in 2020 is larger than what we saw in the Great Recession. At the same time, this recession is definitely different than other ones, and it's probably going to be one of the shortest recessions on record. Now, what I mean by that is the shortest recession we do have on record since the 1850s was the January 80 recession. That lasted 6 months. Now, this recession started in February of 2020. And now we're almost 1 year out, right? February 2021. But hey, there's a group that decides, and I don't know why they're the group that decides, but they're the one that sue. The National Bureau of Economic Research dates business cycles. So it took them hardly any time at all to say, hey, February 2020 was the start of this recession. But it could take them over a year to decide when this recession ends. To give you an example, the Great Recession started in December 2007. They announced that recession started in around December of 2008, a year later after the fact, they said it started. Now, that recession ended in June of 2009. The National Bureau of Economic Research stated, yes, that's when it ended, June 2009. They made that statement in September 2010. So this could still be the shortest recession based on when the dating committee decides when this is in. But there's been a very rapid increase back up. To give you an example, these are annual percentage changes. But the second quarter of 2020, the gross domestic product fell by 31.4%. That is the largest quarterly decrease on an annualized basis since the Great Depression, back in these big, huge red times back here. Now, the next quarter, the third quarter, we had a 31.4% decrease in the second. The third quarter, GDP grew 33.4%. Think about that reverse square root. You go down in the V very deep, and then all of a sudden you come up very quickly too. Now, the other thing I just want to emphasize, and I'll get going to, I think, more interesting things besides the numbers that I love like this. You have a 31% decrease, and then you have a 33% increase the next quarter. You're not back to where you were before. Not even close. Let me give you an example. If you take the number 100, drop 100 by 50%, that takes you from 100 down to the number 50, right? Now you had a 50% decrease. Now have a 50% increase. How much do you go up from 50? You only go up to 75, right? You don't go back up to 100. So this is the idea that even though we had almost equal downturn and equal upturn quarter to quarter, you're not back to where you were before. You still have to grow quite a bit to get back to where you were before that big drop. So I just want to, this is why sometimes I love percentages, because, you know, they help in terms of scaling problems. But when you have huge drops, sometimes percentages aren't that useful. All right, now let's break it down to regions of the US in terms of employment and some unemployment here. So here's a map from the Bureau of Labor Statistics giving the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, and the West. And these are the numbers of jobs lost at the depth of the recession. Now, this is employment from the change from the peak. And basically, the peak was in January 2020. And then we had drops in February, just a little bit, and then in March and April. So this is the drops. But now, up to December of last year, just a month and a half ago, this is the now drops in the jobs. So here is the percent recovered of jobs since the depth of the recession. So we've only recovered, you know, barely half the jobs in the Northeast, but we're almost up to 3/4 of the jobs recovered in the South. Now, you know, so it's interesting, I think, to look at these regional differences. You really have the Northeast and the West somewhat similar in terms of what's been recovered, and you have much higher recoveries in the Midwest and the South. And I somewhat attribute this to how the geographic regions address the COVID-19. Which areas had the more lenient business restrictions and which regions had the more restrictive, right, closures of businesses and so on to fight the pandemic. And I really think the higher populated areas of the West, your Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona's up there too, but these dominate such that they had much more restrictive policies in terms of business operations and people in gatherings. Whereas the South and the Midwest had more lenient type of restrictions going on, right? And you see that same in this chart down here on the unemployment rate. You've got almost everybody had about the same unemployment rate before the pandemic fully hit, very, very close to full employment across the board. Pretty much everybody kind of had the same unemployment rate in the depth of the recession, the South here being kind of the exception. But then the return, once again, you have the Northeast and the West not returning as quickly as the Midwest and the South. And part I think is due to the restrictions. Good or bad, I won't make that value judgment. But, you know, we've had some horrible places in South Dakota and North Dakota with outbreaks in the pandemic that even though this is looking better at the moment, it could made a lingering aspect as we start to even get better and have fewer of the cases going on. This chart just shows here percentage-wise the employment and what the drop in employment now is This is the depth of the recession is the blue. The orange is now through December 20th is our latest data. And notice that all of the regions pretty much had about the same percentage of drop in employment at the depth. Coming back, once again, the Midwest and the South has recovered a little bit faster than the Northeast and the West. Once again, I really think it's how the governments reacted to restricting businesses relative to one or the other. Now, what about the sectors that contributed to this drop? Here, I took this from the Wall Street Journal. The orange are service sectors. The bluish is consumer. Business investment is sort of a dark gray, and a light gray is other. Excuse me. This is related to the 3.5% drop you saw in that earlier graph for all of 2020. And so notice it was really the service sectors, your face-to-face type businesses, that had the biggest drops. Food services, these are restaurants, right? Mainly sit-down type restaurants, face-to-face places. Healthcare, that's interesting. Why would healthcare be one of the biggest drops when healthcare is one of the places we need for fighting the pandemic, for people going into hospitals? A huge amount of healthcare is related to selective like surgeries. You know, who was getting a hip replacement or a nose job or a facelift? Yeah, it wasn't happening, right? And then dentists, who was going to the dentist at the time during this period, right? So these parts of healthcare, which originally we thought wasn't going to drop very much because of the need for hospitalization and healthcare for people fighting the virus, we had that whole segment of healthcare we forgot about. You know, all these sort of selective surgeries and things like that were all shut down. And so it had quite a drop. Recreation, of course, you know, talking about your gyms and so on like that, any sort of concerts, outdoor venues, sporting events, and then transportation services. Definitely the airlines are the biggest chunk here that have really shut down. Now, what went up in this period of time? Durable goods. Now, durable goods, as kind of an economic somewhat definition, are things that last longer than 3 years, right? They don't wear out, or you don't use them up right away, as opposed to non-durable goods. Durable goods, what are people doing at home? They want their home to be better. You know, as we started this webinar, you saw the picture of me at my house. Well, I was having a horrible time with the camera on my notebook before. I went out and I bought a new camera. I bought a new headset with a microphone because I was doing more Zoom type meetings and so on, and this would facilitate that better. People are doing more home improvement. Appliances, TVs, computers. So a lot of this is because of home comfort, I would call it. Because of people stuck at home. Food and beverages, grocery stores, right? You know, there are some people that had never stepped in a grocery store before and now have done so the first time in their life during the pandemic. You know, there wasn't going out to eat anymore. You had to find out some other way to get food. Gasoline was down a little bit. We definitely had driving, and then sort of other goods. Business investments, excuse me. Businesses did slow down a little bit of what they bought in terms of capital type equipment. Change in inventories, because businesses were not producing as much. Anytime inventories start to go down, this is a decrease in economic activity in terms of how we measure things. I won't go into forget it. I won't go in. Residential investment. I'm going to come back to this. Recessions usually decimate the housing market. The home builders, the contractors, everybody goes under. This time around, it has not been the case. So it's a very unusual recession in that terms. And of course, government spending has definitely gone up during this time. So, you know, if you add all these up, it comes out to a net negative 3.5%, which was the yearly drop. But now look at my reverse square root sign. Well, it looks pretty close to the type of business cycle we're trying to describe. You know how long it took to search to find a symbol that was, you know, to look like this and give it a name. That's why it's so sort of weird to call it a reverse square root sign. All right, how about consumer spending overall? And I want to be cognizant of my time here. So I'm going to just quickly, which I don't have a watch in front of me, but I can turn my phone on and I can see that. Anyways, here, so you have the national emergency declared March 13th. Grocery sales, look at that. This is the hoarding. People going in, stocking up their freezers and everything else they can find. Right. We also did the same thing. When we would cook anything, we'd make sure we'd cook for like 4 days and then pack the leftovers in the freezer. And then, of course, as that started to come, after the hoarding aspect was over, it started to get a little bit normal, but still relative to January of 20, still a higher level overall of grocery type expenditures. Restaurants, hotels down 25.9%. The closures and so on, definitely. You had a little bit of restriction lifting in here, but still down tremendously. And then, of course, entertainment, recreation, down 51.8%. Art, museums, all that other. So it's sort of a disproportionate hit here. Now, here talks a little bit about that K recovery. You have all wage groups and their employment drop, but the largest drop is for low wage earners. I'm sorry. And then the recovery is back here. Now look, high wage earners in terms of their employment in this is October of this chart, only 1.2% down. Middle wage and then low wage down. And think about, once again, what are the type of industries that have been hit? You have your restaurants, your hair salons, you have gyms, you have disproportionately those people of lower wages are in those type of industries, and those are the industries that got hit the hardest. I made this chart up because I think because if you ever looked at any other recession, you would look at this and you'd say, I don't know what's going on. This is not a typical recession picture. And what's happened here is that, we had consumer spending go down tremendously, but at the same time, we had total personal income go up. And a lot of this is related to transfer payments. Now, transfer payments are non-earned income aspects. We know transfer payments, the one that you're most familiar with is Social Security, is a transfer payment. But this is because of the government relief packages, the CARES Act. And what happened is that for the lower income people, right, lower wage people, they use those to help pay their rent, to buy groceries, whatever they could. But you have the middle wage and the higher wage people socked it away. Their incomes went up and they weren't spending it. All right. Now, so this is very unusual. And I'm going to come back to this because when we start to look at when the pandemic finally gets over, I think we have a huge amount of pent up demand and the ability to make good on that demand of spending and so on in the economy. And we could have quite the explosion of economic activity once the pandemic is over. A little more local, and these I've borrowed a bunch of slides from the Office of Economic Analysis. As Don said, I used to be director of that office, and these mostly come from Josh Lehner, a great graduate of the economics program at Portland State, and he does absolutely wonderful work. You really need to know Josh Lehner and look at his work. It is absolutely fabulous. So anyways, I called Josh and I said, Josh, can I shamelessly steal your hard work, your sweat and tears? And he said, no problem. So the interesting thing is that Oregon generally, when it goes into recession, falls a lot deeper in recession than the US economy does. And in recovery, it tends to recover faster and stronger. This time around, it's kind of doing about the exact same thing as the US average, both in terms of employment loss, since February of 20. The unemployment rate, about the same as what's being seen in the US. And then wages and salaries, that has occurred about the same as the US. So not too much difference. In terms of the Oregon employment by wage, this goes back to that K recovery type aspect. You can see that the low wage really dropped for Oregon compared to the middle wage and the higher wage group. And so definitely a gap here. And so they definitely are suffering more. This little drop by here in December is because the reinstitution of business restrictions as we got to the Thanksgiving holiday and over the December holidays. But that didn't seem to impact the middle wage and the high wage group. Now, I say over here, losses almost all in leisure and education. Leisure is a catch-all term. This is you're going out to eat, sporting venues, gymnasiums, things like that. Education. Interesting part here is, and this is really a K through 12 hit. Think about it. The teachers are doing distance learning, but do you need the people in the cafeterias? Do you need the janitors? Do you need the bus drivers? And another big group that was hit is substitute teachers. Less need for substitute teachers in local education. So this is where you're seeing sort of the hit occurring. And we're going to come back, by the way, to gender in just a second. Then construction, manufacturing, unusual for recessions, they're only down a little bit, where usually you don't find that. You don't find the service sector being the hardest hit. You usually find the manufacturing sector being the hardest hit in the recession. It's just the opposite in this time around. Now, construction, by the way, these people, house builders, contractors, they know recessions. They know downturns. That's a part of their life. They know how to handle these situations. But the sectors that are being hit now aren't so used to being hit so hard on recessions. And it's almost they're on their learning curve as to how to deal with it. Now here, the racial gap is widening. We already had a racial gap in terms of economic status and income and wages in this country. This is for the US, and you can see that the employment change, and this is set for February 2020, is at where the lines meet here. And you can see that, of course, all racial groups fell. White fell the least. And you can see that the Asian white is about the same. There still is a gap here for Blacks in terms of employment going forward. And this is a mix of industrial areas. And I believe Josh made this up for Oregon. This is Oregon specific on this second graph. And once again, you can see this, there is a gap of Black, Indian, away from the white non-Hispanic, and then Hispanic is down lower again. Once again, these racial groups, where does their employment tend to be concentrated? It's tended to be concentrated in the service industries that were disproportionately hit during this recession. Okay, some gender differences here. Here, we see between men and women, once again, women tend to be disproportionately employed in the type of service industries that were mostly hit during this pandemic. It's come back a little bit, so the gap is not as big as it was before, as we've had some recovery occurring, but we're still down a good 5% a year going. Unemployment rates, once again, the gap has kind of come up. Once again, this is the men had a slight increase in unemployment because of the restrictions that were sort of placed at Thanksgiving and into December. But if you drill down, and Josh Lehner's drilled down a little bit farther. What about women with kids at home as opposed to not at home? And he uses the 25, 54-year-old group because that generally is what they call the employment age group that's out there. And you can see that the drop here, both for women with no kids at home, a lot of this drop is, and this is labor force participation, which means that they dropped out of the workforce. Now, why would you drop out? I think a lot of this is the fear of being at the workplace. If I am in close contact with other workers and so on, am I going to catch the virus? So I think that is a lot of what this has happened in terms of leaving the labor force. Now, it's bounced back a little bit still overall. Remember, this is in relative to the January, February average for the labor force participation. And they're about the same here. But then as we look at this gender gap with kids at home, definitely the women's situation is higher. And why is this? Well, one, I would chalk it up to just social traditions. Who is really responsible for the children at home? I don't, whether you agree with that social tradition or not, I think it's part of what's going on here. Also, with daycare centers and so on being shut down, what are you going to do about the kids at home? You've got to leave the labor force and take care of them. So I think that's part of also the gap that's happening here. And then women have generally been employed in that service industry, and it's not amendable to be able to do work at home. So if you can't work at home and you have to be with the kids, you have this sort of disproportionate drop in participation in the labor force. Rural urban changes. Interestingly, this is kind of reverse of what we've seen in other recessions, where it's the Portland Metro, Portland Metropolitan Statistical Area has the biggest drop. And then we have our other metro areas in Oregon. And then the rural counties have dropped the least in terms of employment relative to February 2020. Now, definitely leisure and hospitality got hit the hardest, right? And where do you have a concentration of the type of service activities and so on, restaurants, so on? It's in the Portland metro area, right? So you're disproportionately hit here. Right? They lack the business travel, commuters stay at home. All of a sudden, people are working from home. The office workers aren't downtown as much as they are, and all that is happening. Now, I think Josh says, reopening the economy, we'll see some return to everyday life. Longer run, we worry about the labor force, productivity growth. He thinks the urban will catch up and finally surpass the rural once we start to have things unfold. And I just want to briefly, just for a second, talk about Portland, because, Portland had the trifecta in the summer here. We had the homeless situation also building up, but it was made worse and the businesses hit and so on because of COVID-19. And then, of course, we had the Black Lives Matter movements, we had the protests, and then using the protests, this is only my opinion, using the protests of undercover, we had the vandalism of downtown, the breaking windows and so on, and not a good situation. And then we had a short-term hit, the third part of the trifecta, the wildfires and the smoke and so on that also started to shut down downtown, just as they were starting to ease a little bit of the restrictions for businesses to open. So I really think Portland will come back. I've been reading articles. There's a Forbes article that compares Portland to Pompeii, saying that it's completely a disaster and it's done and it's writing its epitaph. I really think it will come back because we're only looking at about a year downturn in downtown Portland. This isn't a Midwest Rust Belt decades old problem. You know, we're not a Detroit that had to go through decades of problems. This is 1 year, and I think it will come back. And then rental people. You know, when you're out of work and you're already living in an area that has generally high rents, what do you do? So here is from the census data that Josh found, expected to be evicted, behind on their rent, worried about next rent. And these are the percentage of renters. And this is in Oregon. Notice the spike here as we're getting into December. That was because the CARES Act that was passed last March that helped renters. We had conviction, right? Embargoes, maybe not embargoes, but you couldn't evict people, right? We had those things occurring. Those were all expiring in December. And so the degree of concern among renters was rising. The unemployment benefits that they were getting on top of the usual unemployment benefits from the states, all those were stopping in December. And so there was a greater, I think, concern and worry. Then they passed the next act in December of 2020, and those started to come down. Now, these are still worrisome, and this is sort of bad, right? We're looking at people worried about how to pay the 20%, you know, 1 in 5. Now, Portland State has done their own study in the area on renters in conjunction with the Community Alliance of Tenants. And they find that 77% of tenants have either paid full or part of their rent. It's a little bit higher than the census data. But then they have disproportionately, you know, your Black, Indigenous, and people of color. They also are down now to only 59% have paid some, and this is as of last July when they did this. So they are very concerned about this, and I think, well, they should be. And part of this too is, you know, a lot of these people are in what is called forbearance. You know, forbearance basically is, well, you can't pay me now, pay me tomorrow. And so sometime in 2021, they have to pay back rent. Well, a lot of these people, as it says here, owe some back rent. They may not be able to meet those higher back rent payments. Even though the economy recovers, they may be getting jobs back and so on. There's this extra burden that's going to be placed on them to be able to meet these rent payments. So that what I call one of the headwinds in terms of when we actually have recovery and economic growth again, because of this debt overhang that some people will be feeling. And once again, it tends to be disproportionately hit on people of color, people of low wages and income. Population growth is another thing that we're concerned about. The belief is that near term, nobody was moving anywhere. And we really are in Oregon, if to population growth. And hey, I know there are people out there that say, hey, I'm in Oregon, I love it here, close the door behind me, don't let anybody else in. But a lot of economic growth is dependent on population growth. And so the forecast that the Josh's office has put out has really lowered that population growth. And most of it is because of net in-migration is basically responsible for the vast majority of population growth these days, rather than natural population growth. We're almost, by the way, and actually we tipped it just recently, because I think of the pandemic and the increases in deaths because of the virus, we've had more deaths in Oregon than we've had births. And the expectation is that's going to be even more so as we get into the later years of this new decade. So Josh puts this out here. I'll just let you read that. Okay. I think I'm just going to skip over this because I've got other things I want to talk about. It just really talks about, you know, what businesses have experienced recessions. We don't like this little rise in permanent job loss because that becomes sort of systemic and it's tougher to to get these people back into work, as opposed if you're just temporarily laid off. Now, this was the assistance bill that was passed in December. This follows on the heels of the CARES Act, which was passed in March. And the basic thing is it's basically half the size of what the CARES Act was. And I won't go through all of these things here. Let's talk about Biden's 1.9 trillion that is expected to be coming and possibly passed in this March. And if you want to think about dates and deadlines, March 15th is kind of the deadline when the package that was passed last December expires. So they got to get this if they're going to have a continuation of these relief packages to be passed in March. Bumping up the stimulus checks, but instead of everybody getting them, once again, they're going to have more targeted, I think, this time around. You have to, you only get this if you're making up to $75,000 per year. If you make more than that, you'll get less than $1,400, and then it cuts off at a certain higher amount. Unemployment benefits. These will be on top of your state benefits, $400 a week. This is a $100 increase from the December of $300, which is good. This is what is needed. Expanded child tax credit. And then this is be interesting. I don't know. It'll be a fight in Congress for the $15 an hour minimum wage. Right now, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. Interestingly enough, just as a sidebar here, we're pretty much close to $15 an hour here in Oregon. We have a 3-tiered system, but it's about up $13 area right now in the Portland metro area. And the interesting thing is, if this does go to 15 hours, businesses in Oregon have already been dealing with a much higher minimum wage. They've incorporated in their business models. They've been working with it. Other parts of the country that haven't figured this out yet and are jumping from 725 to 15, if this passes, will have a much more difficult time in addressing this increase in costs. So we're in good shape, I think. So if this happens, this does reduce poverty, by the way. But as an economist, in my opinion only, this does affect the number of people employed. And there will be slightly less people employed by going to a higher minimum wage. It's a trade-off. You do decrease poverty because of the higher minimum wage. You decrease slightly, though, the number of people employed. All right. So, and this time around, interestingly enough, there may be better assistance for state, local, and tribal governments than we've seen in either of the other two packages. Now, going forward, what to expect? Here's an interesting chart from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. These are total checkable deposits. You can kind of think of those like your checking account that you have at a bank. Notice that, oh my goodness, and these kind of match with the CARES Act that was passed in March and checks that people were getting. Remember the high wage and the middle wage people? What they were worried about the economic situation and they saved it. They stuck it away. And why check it? Why in a checkable deposit? Well, you got interest rates at 0. It doesn't matter if I can get to it right away or I put it in a CD, hardly any difference at all. Let me be able to get at it right away and put it in a checkable deposit. So this is part of that dam that's holding back potential spending that I've talked about earlier. You got all this money here. When it feels safe to go out and to spend, and a pent-up demand on top of it, you could have a flood of spending happening when that dam breaks. Now, the other part is how consumers, what happened? Oh, I know what I did wrong. Never mind. There we go. It took me back to the Federal Reserve at a second there. Now, Josh put this together because one of the jobs that is done at his office is to forecast lottery revenues. So they also track lottery revenues. If you think about how consumers might react to when things are better, this may be an indication of how people might react to spending again. Here you have 2019. These are Oregon video lottery sales, right? And you can see them here and pretty constant around a little under 20 million. And then you have 2020, the dark blue. And then what happens? You shut down restaurants. They can't go in to play video lottery. Lottery revenues go to zero. You start to open some of the restaurants back up. What happens? Man, you almost get right back to where you were before in short order, right? A couple months. And then what? You have Thanksgiving, the December restrictions, back down to zero. Now we're in 2020. We're starting to lift them up. I bet this is going to go right back. So I think, if this is some indication of people's willingness to spend, you start having things go somewhat back to normal. It's not going to take hardly any time at all to go back to where we were. All right. So I'm going to finish up real quick because I'm taking way too much time. I can see here. Here's that quarterly drop I said before. This is a forecast of where overall economic activity is going to grow quarterly on an annualized basis. And if you work this out, you get back to where we were in overall economic activity sometime in this year, the second or third quarter of this year. But things are bouncing back so quickly that now a lot of economic forecasters are thinking we might be back this quarter to the same level of GDP that was before the recession hit. And then while this output, employment will take a little bit longer to get back to where it was before, maybe by mid-2023. Now people are thinking that, no, this could actually be even a little bit sooner. We might even have employment back in late 2022. So the bounce back is now starting to look a lot faster than what was expected. All right, let's finish up here. The hereafter, the adverb. What might we expect? Definitely, we're going to get a face-to-face return. People are social. They want to go out. They want to go to restaurants. So we're going to have all these, I think, return back pretty much to normal. I would say if the vaccines and so on work the way they're supposed to work, we're probably seeing this as the fourth quarter of this year, getting somewhat more back to normal after we get to some sort of, herd group of vaccination occurring. Now, my own opinion, by the way, I'm 67. My first opportunity will be March 1st to sign up to get an appointment for my vaccine. I have every confidence that I'll get my first shot in July. I just don't have the confidence that they are doing this in a very reasonable way at all. Anyways, that's my opinion. Now, once again, who's going to come back first? The smaller your group involved, the more you're going to come back. Hair salons, very small group, easy to protect people and so on. They're going to come back. The bigger your venue where you have larger groups, the longer it will be back. Really, I think domestic air travel and so on will be one of the last groups to come back. I hope you all got your real ID, by the way, because, come October, unless your passport is current, you're not going to be joining the masses, in my mind, with the pent-up demand of people traveling. I think distance learning, it's going to be more a mainstay than it ever was before in higher education. I think it'll be less so in K through 12. And income inequality, it was improving, by the way. We were getting better. We were getting people of the lower income stratosphere to actually start to improve because of longer economic activity that was occurring. And then it got a horrible hit again because of the disproportionate hit on those businesses. And I think it's going to, unfortunately, take a number of years of continued economic growth to get back to that level. So what's going to be more of an alter state or reduced form? I think there's going to be a bigger demand, and we've already seen it, for detached single-family homes. And these homes will look a little differently. Outdoor entertainment areas is going to be all the rage, and every house has to have a home office. My home office that you saw in the background as we started this has boosted my home value just because I have a separate home office. Office space downtown. Here's commercial real estate. I think is really going to change. We finally had the true experiment of working from home. And I think people really did enjoy it. They liked not having the commute time. And some businesses actually felt their workers were more productive because there wasn't the commute time involved. And they actually got more work out of them in an 8-hour sort of set workday because, right? They weren't either tired from commuting and so on. It was more concentrated, and people liked it. You know, it was so cool to live downtown Portland, and that's where all the high prices and so on. And now all of a sudden, people want to live back in the suburbs. Will that remain or not? Or will the coolness of downtown come back again? And I really think we're going to be more like many of the Asian countries where mask wearing, anytime there's a flu epidemic or whatever goes on there, more masks come out. I think we'll start to see that more of a practice here too. Now, this is a sidebar. I did a presentation for the American Association of Law Schools in January. And they wanted me to, and this may have some apropos to Portland State and enrollments that we see here. And so here are some aspects I think are relevant to when we talk about recessions and enrollments. Really, you know, opportunity costs of lost wages of employment are less. So if I go to school now, I'm not really giving up much of employment. And so why not go to school? It's a time to reflect on career changes. And unfortunately, state budgets tend to be constrained while this happens. Notice, you know, this may be I didn't put out Portland State's enrollment, but these are for all law schools in the U.S. Not a pretty picture of this drop, you know, after 2011 for law school employment enrollments. Although just recently they've had a little bit of an uptick. This recession is different. What we're seeing right now is that advanced degrees, healthcare, tech, sort of your professional sciences, your natural sciences, they're following this sort of general rule that in recessions, enrollments tend to go up because the choices are not, you're not giving up as much by going back to school. But there's many universities that have actually dropped PhD admissions for humanities and social sciences for the fall of this year because of students, I think, really thinking about taking a pause. We've seen hiring freezes at university, right? Possible enrollment pauses. Think about your standard universities that have dormitories. They were gaining, right, revenues from those dormitories. They're not getting those revenues anymore. Really, really tough situation for, I think, higher education. Now, interestingly enough, higher income families weren't hit as hard. So I think some of your private schools, universities, colleges, housing, you know, parental, what I call parental scholarships to their children won't be as impaired during this recession as elsewhere. And I really think we're going to see a much more specialized training and certificate type degrees now that we have much more online type classes rather than your traditional type of 4-year type of degrees or master degree, PhD degree. You'll see a lot more of these specialized training and certificate type degrees going forward. And by the way, what's your competition at a university now that everybody's going to online classes? It's not just getting students from your own population area. You know, University of Oregon is competing with University of Texas as an example. So the competition is going to be much worse. Hey, for us, unfortunately, it's not a good sign. This is a projection of 25 to 29-year-olds, kind of the bread and butter for Portland State in terms of enrollment ages, are all expected to decline in the first half of this year, of this decade. Not good. So let me finish up. I took too much time. Why don't we open up to questions?
I think there's one in the chat over there.
Oh, sure. Will the Oregon Unemployment Office ever become more service oriented? Yes. When the bar's been set so low, yes, they will become more service oriented. And unfortunately, you know, they've gone through, what was it, like 3 directors of that department. And I think they finally got the word that they need to be more service oriented. It's very tough, by the way, to change your complete computer operation in the middle of something like this. I mean, they definitely need to change that to update their computer systems to be able to handle better these situations. But unfortunately, you can't really do that in the middle of what's going on now. But yes, yes, they will. Very interesting, Tom. What has happened to the national debt in the last 4 years?
Yeah.
Well, right now, our debt to GDP ratio is just about where it was during World War II in terms of percentage. Now, in World War II, you know, it was a war effort all out in order to fight during World War II. And we just let the debt go. Deficits were huge.
Mary, hi. How are you?
So the same situation here, though, is that
Okay, thanks.
here in my mind, we made a mistake. We had the Trump administration cutting taxes tremendously and not really cutting any sort of spending, increasing the military budget and things like that. And we increased a big deficit, and then the outstanding debt went up during an economic upturn. These are the times when you're supposed to have the debt come down, you know, a little bit more savings during good economic times. And then you have that, and then the pandemic hits, and you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and you're forced to now have even higher deficits and then more debt. Now, there are groups out there that say, hey, we don't have to worry about it. You know, we could have the debt go up, we're fine. Now, I'm not quite in that camp. Now, there's a difference between saying that we can handle the national debt as opposed to saying there is no ceiling. We could just spend and spend and spend and there's no problem. I believe we're still at a point where we can handle this size of a debt, but there is some time where there's too much debt. You start to look like a Greece or an Italy, or and people start questioning your treasury bills, your borrowing capability, and you get into trouble. So I don't think we're in trouble yet. And I think this was absolutely right. When you have a horrible situation, you throw everything in the kitchen sink at it. But that doesn't mean you ignore this national debt. Once things get back to normal and so on, you've got to think of a path as how we can start to now get this down. Because if you can't get it down, you've run out of bullets the next time you have a problem. Let's see. What is the forecast for economic inequality? Well, right now it's gone down. It's become worse because of the pandemic and the type of businesses that got hit during this pandemic. They will start to improve, but history has shown us that improvement in income inequality takes years of economic growth to have that happen. Now, hopefully, we're getting rid of the structural problem of the inequality, which is discrimination, biases, and we're alleviating those aspects so that when you have economic growth, the gap closes more quickly. But unfortunately, you still have those biases. Racial discrimination is still out there to a degree. And so just as we saw improvement after we had almost 10 years of economic recovery, unfortunately, it will start to get better, but we have to have those extended years of economic growth to see better improvement. What will be the relative budgetary pressure be on PSU versus OU and OSU? I think we need Reynolds here to give us more of a clue on that. Once again, I think the pressure will be sort of equal to all these groups. We are less dependent at PSU on things like dormitories than OSU or U of O is, so that there's, in a sense, less of a hit in terms of revenue losses to us, just in that particular category. But really, if students are taking a year sabbatical and saying, I rather not take courses online, I'll sit out a year. And then also, once again, PSU, U of O, OSU, once you have online degrees, you're in competition with the rest of the country. We're, Southern New Hampshire, University, all those ads you see on TV. That's the kind of competition that's even going to be more stiff now going forward. And you don't have your little geographic, monopoly of bringing people into your area as you did before. So it's going to be a tough situation, very tough. I don't
Tom,
know. Yeah,
Tom,
yes, Helen.
can I ask a question?
Sure.
I did the one on economic inequality, but one of the other things is not just growth because of educational opportunity. Given the online courses and the unequal opportunities for them for low income at grades, K1 through 12, plus the lack of wherewithal in terms of higher education that you see, that's going to have a longer term effect on economic opportunity for low income. And that worries me a little bit.
Yeah, what you see, we've got a race against time. If the quicker we can get through this pandemic, the lesser will be the long-term impacts of it. But you're right, Helen. To the extent that we've left behind students in K through 12 through distance learning, and I don't know about you, maybe your kids and so on that you've talked to. I have not heard a resounding, wonderful statement about distance learning at K through 12. If anything, most parents I've talked to have been very disappointed with it. So, and the access to it, as Helen alludes to. So yes, those will be longer term effects. I hope we start to see our K through 12 say, look, this coming summer, forget it. We're not having summer off. We've got to have classes to make up lost time and so on of what occurred. And I hope that happens. But in terms of the income inequality and so on, the expense of going to higher education, that will continue to be a problem. Because then you definitely have more of that separation between the haves and haves not. Because definitely higher education is a ticket to a better economic life going forward.
Well, Tom,
Yes.
thank you very much for your talk. We probably should end just about 1 o'clock.
Okay.
And I'd like to leave a little bit of time for Dawn to give us teasers about the next member meeting next month, at least. But thank you very much. It was vastly informative, and we would like to get a copy of it. So I guess we could work with Samantha, the office manager, to get a recorded version of this. So thank you. Thanks all for attending. And Dawn, you've got the program, and you're still muted, by the way.
Thank you for that reminder. So next month's meeting is going to be on Thursday, March 18th, which is our March program is traditionally a potluck, followed by a presentation by Christine Meadows and her opera student programs. No potluck this year, no in-person meeting. We'll have a meeting over Zoom, and we will find out from Christine and her colleague Chuck Dillard how you put on a spring opera production virtually. The opera this year is a one-act opera buffa by Giancarlo Menotti called The Old Maid and the Thief. And the opera program is doing not one production of this, but two, one with an all-male cast, one with an all-female cast. So it's going to be very interesting to hear from Chuck and Christine. They're in the process of, they taped each student's role individually, and now they're in the process of putting it together to come up with some kind of a production that can then be aired. So they're not quite as far along in the process as they thought they would be, having started in the fall. I found out from talking to Christine last week, but they're going to have a program to show us next month on how far they've gotten and what the challenges were in getting to this point. So you'll be reading about that more in next month's rap sheet, and we will look forward to having you all here.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Um,
Stay
um,
safe.
Just before
Stay
you
with-
go,